Hi, welcome to another episode of Beyond Just Fine. So, I was wondering, how many of us have sometimes found ourselves lying in bed, replaying conversations that we had earlier in the day? Maybe we're thinking, did I say the wrong thing? Did they take that the wrong way? Maybe I should have said this instead. Or perhaps we've got a decision to make and we find ourselves going over every possible option again and again until eventually we feel even less clear than when we started. Or maybe we just find ourselves spending a lot of time worrying about things that haven't even happened yet. Now, if any of that sounds familiar, you're certainly not alone. Today, I thought we would talk about overthinking, why we do it, why it can be so difficult to switch off, and most importantly, some simple things that we can try when we notice that we're getting stuck in our heads. Now, it's important to understand that the aim isn't to stop thinking. Thinking is good. We need to think things through, make decisions, learn from our experiences, and plan for the future. The problem is when our thinking becomes repetitive, and then it can stop being useful. And maybe one of the simplest ways to describe overthinking is thinking that isn't taking us anywhere. So we might think about the same situation 10, 20, even 50 times, but we're not actually getting any closer to a solution. We're just going round and round in circles. And that in itself can give us a really useful question to ask ourselves when we notice this happening. Am I solving a problem? Or am I repeatedly thinking about a problem? Because there's a difference. Now, if there's something we can actually do, that's great. We can work out what the next step is and we can take some action. But if we're repeatedly analysing something that has already happened, or maybe worrying about something that hasn't yet happened, there may not be anything more that thinking can actually achieve. Now, sometimes we assume that the problem with overthinking is simply that we think too much. But what if that's not quite what's happening? What if we've learned patterns that keep us searching for certainty, reassurance, approval, or the perfect answer before we feel fully able to trust ourselves? Maybe there's a part of us saying, I need to be certain before I make this decision. I need everyone else to approve. I'm not sure if I can fully trust my own judgment. I need to get this exactly right. And when those thoughts become familiar, we can start to mistake them for who we are. But they're not necessarily who we are. They're just patterns of thinking. They're just narratives that our minds have developed to help us make sense of what's happening. And sometimes those narratives are helpful, but sometimes they can keep us stuck. Now, the good thing is we don't have to automatically believe every story that our mind comes up with. We can pause. We can just become curious about it. We can even question it. And sometimes we can then begin to develop a different, more helpful way at looking at the situation. So when we catch ourselves overthinking, rather than simply asking, why can't I stop thinking about this? Maybe it might be perhaps a little bit more helpful to become a little curious about what's hiding underneath the overthinking. We could ask ourselves, what am I telling myself right now? What am I afraid might happen? What am I believing I need in order to feel okay? And sometimes just simply noticing the story that we're telling ourselves can just help give us that little bit of distance from it. Now, there are lots of different reasons why we overthink, and I'm sure that I can think of a few that most of us can relate to. So, number one, we want certainty. We often think that if we just keep thinking about something for long enough, we'll eventually know exactly what to do. But unfortunately, life doesn't always work like that. We can plan, we can prepare, and we can make the best decision we can with the information that we have. But we can't always know exactly how something is going to turn out. And sometimes overthinking is really just our attempt at trying to create some form of certainty where perhaps certainty simply isn't available. Number two, we're afraid we might get it wrong. And this can happen especially when something feels really important. Maybe it's a decision we're trying to make about, let's say, changing our job. Maybe we need to have a difficult conversation with someone. Suddenly, our mind starts producing hundreds of possible outcomes. What if I make the wrong decision? What if it doesn't work? What if I regret it? What if I say the wrong thing? And the more that we try to guarantee that we won't make a mistake, the more difficult it can then become to make any decision at all. Sometimes we just have to accept that we can make the best decision that we can with what we know at the time, and then we just adjust it if we need to. Number three, we care about what other people think. So we might replay conversations and wonder how we came across. We might analyze someone's text message. We might wonder why someone hasn't replied. And our mind can very quickly fill in the gaps. Remember, as we said last week, our brains can create stories and narratives to help us make sense of things. Now, the difficulty is we can try to work out what someone else is thinking, but reality is we can't actually know unless they tell us. So we can then end up spending an enormous amount of time and energy trying to find explanations to problems that may not even exist. And number four, sometimes our minds are just trying to protect us. One of the brain's important functions is to help keep us safe. And we're naturally very good at noticing potential problems. And that's useful. So let's say we want to cross the road. We want to notice that there's traffic coming. Or maybe we're preparing for something important and we probably want to think about what could go wrong so that we can be prepared. But sometimes that protective part of us can become overactive and it can become difficult to switch off. Can then keep saying, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And before we know it, we've gone from thinking about one possibility to imagine 20 different things that could possibly go wrong. So what can we do when we spot ourselves overthinking? Well, there are some simple things that we can try. First, we could ask ourselves, what can I control? So when we notice ourselves worrying about something, we can divide it into two simple categories. What can I control and what can't I control? So, for example, we can't control what another person thinks of us. We can't control exactly how someone will respond. And we can't control everything that happens in the future. But we can control how we communicate. We can control whether we prepare. And we can control what action we take today. So rather than spending all of our energy on the things that we can't control, we can just simply bring our attention back to the things that we can. Another thing we can try to do is to try and get the thoughts out of our heads, because sometimes thoughts can feel so much bigger when they're just bouncing around inside our heads. And writing them down can actually be really useful. Now, it doesn't have to be a beautiful journal entry. You can literally just get a scrap piece of paper. Doesn't have to be your neatest handwriting either. It's just writing down what's on your mind. You could even give yourself what's sometimes known as a worry window or worry time, where you set aside, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, and you just write down what's worrying you. And then you can use that time to look at what you've written and see if, where possible, you can see if there's anything you can actually do about what you're worrying about. Or you could simply just take that scrap piece of paper and just write everything that's in your head until you've got everything out. You could even ask yourself three simple questions. What am I thinking? What can I actually control? What is my next step? Now, that last question is probably quite an important one because overthinking can sometimes keep us focused on the entire situation. So instead, we can then just ask ourselves, what's the next small thing that I can do? Because it's not necessarily figuring about the whole situation, it's just trying to work out what the next small step could be. Another thing to be aware of when we're overthinking is whether we're looking for an answer that may not exist. So sometimes we can keep asking ourselves the same question because we're hoping that eventually we will find an answer that gives us complete certainty. But perhaps there isn't one. Perhaps we don't know exactly what will happen. Perhaps there are several possible outcomes, and that's all okay. Sometimes the most helpful thing we can say to ourselves is, I don't know yet, and I don't have to know yet. And that can just help take some of the pressure off. Now, it also can help to bring ourselves back to the present moment, because overthinking often takes us backwards into the past or forwards into the future. We're either replaying what's already happened or we're imagining what might happen. So trying to bring ourselves back to what's actually happening right here, right now, can help us just step out of that thought loop. And this is where mindfulness can be really useful. So mindfulness is just using our senses, having a looking around. What can we see? What can we hear? What can we smell? What can we feel? Or maybe it's just about taking some slow, deep breaths just to help ground ourselves. Maybe it's going for a walk. Sometimes changing what we're doing, getting some movement, spending a little time outside, it can just help shift that attention away from those repetitive thoughts. Might even be making yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, just doing something simple just to bring your attention back to the right here, right now, the present moment. And it's not necessarily trying to fight the thought. Sometimes it's just simply noticing it and saying, there I go again, thinking about this again. And then it's just gently bringing our attention back to what's happening right here and right now. Sometimes it's also about understanding that good enough really can be good enough. So we can put an enormous amount of pressure on ourselves to make the perfect decision, to make the perfect choice, or to have the perfect response. But perfection isn't always necessary. We just need to make a reasonable decision with the information that we have at the time, and then just move forward from there. And if we have to make adjustments along the way, that's absolutely fine. We can just learn as we go. And if that takes us on a different direction, then that's absolutely okay. It might be that we just have to try again. So it's not about trying to have everything figured out and trying to get everything right the first time. It's just about trying to make the best decision we can and then just go from there. And maybe that's where overthinking connects to something a little bigger, trust. Because sometimes what we're really struggling with isn't necessarily the decision itself, it's just trust in ourselves to be able to handle whatever happens after we've made that decision. So we might think to ourselves, what if I get it wrong? What if people don't approve? What if I regret my decision? What if I'm not doing enough? But the answer isn't always to think harder. Sometimes the answer is just to begin building trust in ourselves. So we don't suddenly need to become completely confident or just to stop having doubts. It's just reconnecting with ourselves and just learning to trust ourselves a little bit more. And sometimes that can include taking a pause and just tuning into our body and just finding out, how does our body feel when we're thinking about the decision we need to make? Do we notice any tension? Maybe there's a sense of relief, feeling of unease. And those sensations can sometimes give us really useful information about how we're responding to the situation. We can then bring that information together with the facts, with the circumstances, and with our own reasoning. And that can help give us a much more balanced way of approaching decisions. So the next time we notice ourselves overthinking, maybe just pause, take that deep breath, and ask ourselves, am I solving a problem, or am I just simply going round in circles? And if I'm going round in circles, what can I control here? And then maybe, is there one small thing that I can do next? It doesn't have to be the entire solution, just one small thing. We might also ask ourselves, is this thought helping me, or is this just keeping my mind busy? And sometimes that one question is enough just to create a little bit of space between us and our thoughts. Because when we can create some distance from our thoughts, we can then begin to observe them rather than just becoming tangled up in them. And remember, we don't have to have everything figured out. We don't have to know exactly what the future holds, and we don't have to have the perfect answer. It's not about never having another worrying thought or never overthinking again. And it's not about switching our minds off completely. It's just about recognizing when we're stuck in those thought loops, noticing what's happening, and then just gently trying to step out of it. Because we're allowed to think things through without thinking ourselves into exhaustion. As always, be kind to yourself. Remember to like and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you next time.